Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the MSI Optix MEG381CQR+. This is a 38-inch ultra-wide gaming monitor with a UWQHD resolution, that's 3840 by 1600 and 21 by 9 aspect ratio. And in this video, I'm going to be talking to you about the various highlights of this monitor, going into my experiences and the quirks of it, and there are some interesting ones. For example, you'll notice at the bottom of the screen now, during these clips, there's some Rgb lighting. That is SteelSeries powered through SteelSeries GameSense, which is one of the ways they sell it. It also works with MSI's Mystic Light, because obviously it's an MSI product. And there's also an on-screen display and several menu options with 2 different menu buttons, which is a curiosity. Now, this monitor in itself is a bit of an oddity, being that it's sort of a mixture or a stopgap between ultra-wide and ultra-fast refresh. Obviously, there's a lot of 1080p monitors out there that are capable of 360Hz refresh rate, and this is bigger than that with a higher resolution. That WQHD resolution, obviously 3840 by 1600 is more than 1080p, and you would struggle to get 360 Hz out of that, and that's why you have a maximum of 175 Hz refresh rate. It has HDR 600 and some other insane specs that I'll leave in the description, as well as a curved display to it. Now, you will notice a little bit of a curve from these clips, but one thing to bear in mind is this is also mostly filmed on an ultra-wide lens, so that sort of enhances that look. And a bit more on that later on though, because I found that the curve isn't enough, because it's 2300R, which I actually found to be quite flat looking overall. Although when you're looking at it from the rear, it does look quite curved. And one of the other things that isn't clear in this clip, but is quite prominent, is it's quite chunky as well. It's quite thick, sits quite deep. It isn't a small monitor by any means. However, it is striking in a number of different ways. That Rgb lighting that you saw on the front also runs around the back, so there are some elements of Rgb on the back, although it's not bright enough to bounce off the wall, for example. There's a menu button here, which is essentially a little joystick that you can move in multiple directions, and I'll show you the menu system a bit later on, because there are a lot of settings that you can change between. I mentioned already HDR 600 is G-Sync Ultimate compatible. There's loads of settings in terms of the backlight and the blackness and other things that you need to play around with. And that's one of the things I found that I had to play around with it a lot. It also has USB pass-through, so you can see there's some USB ports on there. You have a USB-A to USB-B connection that plugs in and connects up. And there's another dial on the other side which activates the on-screen display and lets you go through some menus on the bottom left. You'll also see that SteelSeries GameSense logo here next to the power button, which sits on the right hand side, as well as the large MEG logo as well. Now, it's worth noting that this uses a kettle plug and a few other things of note. For example, I said it goes up to 175 Hz refresh rate, but that is only over Displayport, so you need a Displayport cable to do that. You'll notice there are HDMI connections on here, but you can only get up to 85 Hz refresh rate with Displayport, and there are some differences if you're using console here as well. These tests have all been on PC, and you can only get up to 2K resolution on PS5, of full HD at 120 Hz, so this might not be best for PlayStation use. Now, if you dive into the menus, you'll see there are a lot of different options, and here we have different modes for your gaming, which obviously changes the color of the screen and the vividness of it and all those settings in there. You can also see a highlight of what's currently happening at the top, so you'll see, for example, this current resolution is 60 Hz refresh rate in a moment when I'm tweaking it. HDR's off, G-Sync and other things. Also running through HDMI at the moment, which is one of the mistakes I made early on. As I mentioned, that's how I found out about it only running through DisplayPort with the high refresh rate. You can go into the settings and turn the refresh rate on so you can see what's happening. There's also things like the Game Assistant, which is essentially an on-screen crosshair that you can use if you want to. Quite a common thing for a lot of gaming monitors, but there are a lot of settings to play around with in here, and obviously different things for different settings. So you have the modes for different gaming situations: FPS, RPG, racing, things like that. There's also the G-Sync Esports button, which is essentially G-Sync Ultimate. That gives you the fastest response time. This thing has a 1 millisecond response time, but you'll get the best experience with G-Sync. However, I have found a really mixed bag with this. I had to tweak the settings a lot in order to get it looking right, and then even then, in some instances, it was washed out, which is problematic. Your experience may vary, but it's worth bearing in mind what the quality is going to be like and just how much you have to play around with it. However, there are a lot of options in here and a lot of customization things that you can do. And you will see a lot of clips in this video as I go through and show you the games that I was playing to test it out with as well. Now, the display in the bottom left, as I said, on-screen display, I will show you later on some of the software from this because you need MSI's Dragon Center software, or the Control Center software as it's now known, in order to customize this. And you can change what's displayed on here, and it will show things like your current play settings, for example, including your resolution. It will also allow you to change between RTS, RPG, and all those other sorts of color settings. And you can also even get it to show like the current performance of your CPU and things like that. However, I found that didn't work, but more on that later on. And that probably is just because I don't have an MSI motherboard in the machine that I was testing it with. So it's worth bearing those things in mind. But one of the things I found about this is it's quite distracting having the screen in the bottom left. I found that it distracted from when I was gaming and working on the screen and took away from some of the other experience. You also notice that there is an option for Displayport Overclocking, and at this point I now have 144 Hz as my default refresh rate with this setup. So you do need to play around with the settings and make sure you've got things like G-Sync Ultimate turned on. You're using Displayport, you go into Windows Display settings and you set it up to 175 Hz refresh rate. It's a bit of a fiddle and a faff to get up to this point, but it is possible. You can also turn it on to 10-bit color to get a better color representation out of it. Now, a bit more about what I was talking about earlier on. As I said, this is 2300R curve, and from these shots you will see there is a little bit of a curve. However, I feel when I'm sitting in front of it, when I was sitting in front of this monitor and using it for working on and for video editing and for gaming, what I found was that the curve wasn't strong enough, and that's the thing that I didn't think I would complain about, because I've previously seen smaller monitors with a stronger curve that I found far too much. I've also seen bigger monitors with a bigger curve, which was more satisfying. Obviously this is going to be a personal preference, but I found this curve wasn't quite enough for a monitor of this size, which meant that it was straining my eyes a little bit and I couldn't get on with it, which is a very odd thing. And I don't know, I just really struggled with the curvature of this one. However, what I will say, as you can see from these clips, is it's very vivid, has some good color representation, and also is very customizable in the look of it. Obviously, going through the various different mode settings, you can see the striking difference that it makes between these. This is in Watch Dogs Legions, and that has some pretty decent graphics on it. And this is basically maxed out settings as well. I tried to max out all the games so you can see the most of like the ray tracing and other settings as well. And I'll show you games like Control in a minute. Again, equally maxed out, give you an idea of what's there. But you do have to play around with it. And sometimes I felt like it was a bit washed out or a bit too bright, and I had to tweak the settings a lot in order to get it right. So I feel like when you first get out of the box, you may well need to play around with these settings quite a bit, or perhaps look online for some recommended settings on the best ones to set them up with. I'll be honest, I didn't come up with one that was suitable for all games. I found that I just had to tweak them quite a lot when going between different games, and obviously what you're doing may vary as well. If you're playing a fast-paced competitive shooter like Rainbow Six Siege or CSGO or something, you want to make the most of that refresh rate, you want to crank that up, put the esports stuff on, and put it into FPS mode, but you might find that it's too washed out for a game like Watch Dogs or Assassin's Creed or something like that, where the visuals are much nicer if you focus on the quality, the ultra settings, HDR and other things like that. This only has HDR 600, so it's not the most impressive HDR that I've seen, but if you turn up all the graphics to maximum, make the most of ray tracing and other things, it does look really good. It is a really responsive and clean screen. I didn't see any problems with ghosting or any issues like that. It's very good. It also has an eye care mode, so you can turn that on and reduce some of the blue light during the day as well. So that's pretty handy, and a welcome feature of it. Now, there aren't any speakers built into this, so you will need your own headphones. But as I said, you do have the pass-through capabilities. There is a headphone jack on the monitor, so if you run USB to your PC, you can then plug your headphones into there, whether it's USB headphones or a 3.5mm connection, so you do have the option of doing that. The RGB lighting from the GamerSense, again, just like the display, I found that a little bit distracting. You can change that within the SteelSeries engine software, which I'll show you a bit later on, but you do need to make sure the monitor is connected to your PC in order to do that, and not just by HDMI or DisplayPort connection either. And here you can see some of the visuals from Control, and one of the things I wanted to show is just how bright and dark it can go. So the brightness on this, it has a massive level of dynamic contrast ratio, and the brightness in terms of the nits, again, all the specs in the description if you want to find out more about it. But what I found is the darks are really dark and the lights are really bright, so it is striking the difference that it goes between those. Also found there wasn't any areas where it was grey when it should be black, so it's really responsive in that way. It ticks a lot of the boxes, this monitor, in a lot of different ways. I find I have a few small complaints about it. The curve obviously isn't strong enough for me, as I said, and I did find that I had to fiddle around with the settings a lot in order to get it right. But when you do get it right, it looks really good, really rich colors, and obviously responds really well. And it has a nice balance between being higher resolution count than a 1080p monitor and still has that good fast refresh rate. It might not be as fast as a high-end 360Hz monitor that you could use with NVIDIA's latency analyzer, for example, but it's still pretty fantastic and a nice balance of that. That said, it is very expensive, and that's worth bearing in mind. Now, with the SteelSeries engine software, once you've got that connected up, you can go into that software and then tweak the bar along the bottom. It also applies some RGB lighting to the back, so there are some elements on the back that I'll show you in a second where you can change the RGB lighting on that. But I found that, again, as usual with any monitor I've tested that has RGB lighting on the rear, doesn't seem to be bright enough to warrant it. I don't really know why you'd be bothered about having RGB on the back of your monitor. Depending on where you're putting it in the room, I honestly usually have it facing towards a wall, so it's just pointless. But the lighting on here also isn't that customizable on the front. I found you can go through a different selection of color settings of the usual sort of rainbow effects, but it doesn't really add anything to it, I don't think. It's a bit gimmicky, and it's not a wonderful addition to the system, in my mind at least anyway, but you can see some of the elements of being able to tweak it and add to it. Now, if you use MSI Center, I think you'll probably get the most out of this if you have an MSI motherboard, where you can go into there and you can change the Mystic Light settings, but you can also connect it up and set what settings you want to see in there, and there's a large selection of the different things that you can do. So for example, you can get some of the monitor data through on your CPU and things like that, as I said earlier on. So there's lots of options that you can make the most out of that display with and have those appear in the bottom corner of the screen with ease. Now, I played a lot of different games, some of them quite fast paced, and you can see Forza Horizon 5 looks absolutely fantastic on this screen. And I'm probably not doing it justice because it really does look very good. It responds really well, smooth action, fast paced, obviously. Very pleasing racing game and a very pleasing screen for it. And if you haven't experienced ultra wide before, having a 38-inch 21:9 screen gives you a lot more real estate, and it drags you in and immerses you a lot more. As my default monitor, I have a 49-inch Samsung Odyssey G9, and I find that to be fantastically immersive, but that's a 32:9. This is slightly bigger at 21:9, meaning it's a bit taller and delivers a good experience that's it's a good middle ground, essentially, is what I'm saying, in all departments. Is a good middle ground between being a large ultra-wide monitor and one with a fast refresh rate and one that ticks a lot of different boxes. However, it is incredibly expensive, and if I personally had this amount of money to spend, I would be buying a Samsung Odyssey G9. This has been the Provoked Prawn. I hope you found this video useful. Thanks for watching. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this video useful, interesting, hilarious, or otherwise. Take a look at these other videos that I think you might find interesting as well. And have a look at the description for links and other information you might find useful. Click that join button to see the benefits of being a member of my YouTube channel. And most importantly, have a great life.